The millionaire returned home without warning and suddenly heard strange noises coming from the family's basement laundry room. When he stepped into the room, the sight that greeted him made him cry out. 3:15 a.m. The gleaming black Bentley glided smoothly through the gates of the Sterling mansion, its headlights sweeping a long, sharp path across the unnaturally manicured lawn. Lucas shut off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, his hand caressing the small red velvet box containing the porcelain doll he had quickly purchased at Heathrow Airport. Coming home 2 days early without announcement, he wanted to see Sophie smile a smile that had vanished since his wife, her mother, passed away. Lucas pushed the door open and stepped into the main hall. The air inside the house was cold, striking his skin. Gone was the familiar warm scent of old oak and happier days. In its place was the overwhelming smell of lemongrass essential oil, the kind of industrial fragrance found in soulless five-star hotels overpowering any trace of real life. He loosened his tie, letting out a long, weary sigh. The house was excessively clean, almost eerily so. He intended to head straight upstairs, placing the gift on his daughter's pillow, but his footsteps paused. From the hallway leading down to the service area tucked away behind the kitchen, a thin stream of yellow light spilled out, cutting across the dark marble floor. And then the sound, faint, trickling, rhythmic, like water running in a quiet, deserted cave. At this hour, was it the automatic irrigation system or a burst water pipe? Lucas changed direction, slipping off his shoes, his bare feet stepping onto the ice-cold stone floor. He approached the source of the light, his heart beating a little faster, with an odd premonition. He placed his hand on the doorknob of the service room and pushed gently. The door creaked open. Lucas froze in place. No water pipe had burst. In the middle of the room, saturated with the strong aroma of high-end laundry detergents, Sophie was perched precariously on a white plastic chair, a cheap oversized stool for her tiny frame. His 6-year-old daughter was wearing cream-colored silk pajamas, buttoned primly up to the neck as if ready for a tea party, her fine hair neatly tucked into a hairnet. Before her was a basin of steaming warm water, the surface perfectly still without a single soap bubble. Sophie's bare hands were submerged deep in the water. Lucas squinted, trying to see better through the thin veil of steam. Sophie was holding a specialized, soft-bristled brush, the kind used for grooming racehorses or expensive fur coats. She moved the brush over the collar of a woman's white silk shirt, slowly, gently, with frightening meticulousness. This was not the playful splashing of a child. This was the precise maneuver of a seasoned professional, repeated like a pre-programmed machine without a single wasted motion. Lucas stepped closer, only to notice that her small hands were white, the skin on her fingertips wrinkled and pallid from being soaked too long. They trembled slightly, but every time the brush touched the fabric, the trembling vanished. Lucas placed his large hand on his daughter's shoulder. Sophie. She slowly turned her head. Sophie's large round eyes were deeply shadowed and sunken in their sockets, but there was no sign of sleepiness, only intense concentration, a vacant, soulless blankness that reflected the harsh neon light of the ceiling. Sophie looked at her father, then down at his hand resting on her shoulder. She gently, very gently, used her wet hand to remove Lucas's hand. She put her index finger to her mouth, signaling silence. "Shh, Daddy, you're too loud. The fibers will get startled." Her voice was a dry, reedy whisper. Then she turned back to the basin, continuing her work on the shirt as if Lucas's presence were merely a fleeting illusion. A surge of anger flared in Lucas's chest. He reached out, attempting to pull the brush away. "That's enough, Sophie. Stop this right now." But Sophie clung tightly to the edge of the basin. Her entire small body tensed up, her feet gripping the slippery plastic stool to resist her father's pull. She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on a faint smudge on the shirt collar, murmuring like an incantation, "Not clean enough, not soft enough. Mommy Bella will be sad. Must finish." Lucas intended to lift her up regardless of her resistance. Just then, the service room door behind him opened wide. Isabella stood there, blocking the cold air draft from the hallway that rushed into the steam-heated laundry room. She wasn't wearing messy nightclothes like someone who had just been woken up in the middle of the night. She was dressed in a form-fitting black yoga outfit that emphasized her toned physique, her face lightly made up and flawless. In her hands, an iPad screen cast a pale blue glow, clearly illuminating her strangely alert eyes. She walked into the room, the soft rubber soles of her shoes making almost no sound on the tiled floor. She walked straight past Lucas, treating him like an invisible obstruction, heading directly toward Sophie, who was huddled on the stool. Isabella bent down, her long manicured fingers lightly brushing the wet silk shirt collar Sophie was clutching. She gently stroked the fabric, checking its cleanliness, then nodded almost imperceptibly. The anger choked in Lucas's throat erupted. He quickly stepped forward, blocking the space between Isabella and his daughter, pointing directly at the wall clock ticking past 3:20 in the morning. "Explain yourself right now." Isabella didn't flinch. She raised a hand toward Lucas, her palm facing him in a gesture to stop, while her eyes never left the iPad screen. Her finger quickly swiped across the glass, inputting data into some complex spreadsheet. "You are disrupting her biological rhythm, Lucas. Lower your voice." "Biological rhythm? At 3 in the morning? Look at her. She's 6 years old. Are you exploiting her labor?" Isabella sighed, a long, weary sigh reserved for the unenlightened. She turned the iPad screen toward Lucas. It wasn't news or social media, but a cluttered chart of blue and red lines flashing continuously with the title, Flow State Graph. "Take a look. This is Sophie's brain concentration index for the last 30 minutes. The blue line is at its peak. She is in a perfect flow state. If you interrupt her now, the entire morning neural stimulation protocol will be ruined." Lucas stared at the jumble of colored charts he didn't understand then, at his daughter trembling slightly from the cold and fatigue. He slapped the iPad aside, the sound of the metal case hitting his suit button ringing out sharply. "I don't care about your ridiculous theories. I care that my daughter is standing here washing your clothes in the middle of the night." But Lucas stood close enough to see that her fingers were pressing down lightly, keeping the child's head pointed toward the basin, a silent reminder of her task. "Good girl, Sophie." Isabella said, her voice smooth like meditation music. "Daddy just got back, so he doesn't understand our rules yet." "You explain it to him. Who are you doing this for?" Sophie swallowed hard, lifting her tear-filled eyes to look at Isabella with devotion. "For me, Mommy. You said successful people must know how to master their time. I want to be my best version." Isabella smiled with satisfaction. She pulled her phone from her pocket, opening a brightly colored app named Elite Baby. She tapped the screen lightly. Ting, the crisp sound of a point notification rang out, breaking the tense atmosphere. a simple, senseless sound, yet it had a strange effect on Sophie. Hearing the ting, Sophie's rigid shoulders instantly relaxed. The look of fear vanished, replaced by a slight smile, mechanical and frighteningly radiant. She immediately turned back to the basin, placed the shirt down, picked up the brush, and resumed her scrubbing with greater speed and determination than before. 10 bonus points for persistence, Isabella said, still looking at her phone. You're about to level up to elite warrior Sophie. Keep going. Lucas stood still, staring at the scene unfolding before him. He felt as if he were standing outside an invisible glass wall, separating him from the bizarre world the two of them had constructed. In that world, exploitation was called training, fear was called persistence, and a father's love was regarded as ignorant interference. He took a step back, his arms hanging helplessly at his sides. His daughter was right in front of him, but he felt as though she was thousands of miles away, lost in a psychological maze he didn't know how to enter. Isabella slipped her phone back into her pocket, adjusting her workout top strap. She turned and walked toward the door, her gait graceful and utterly confident, without sparing Lucas a single backward glance. You can stand there and watch if you want, but stop bothering her. She called back, her voice light yet sharp as a blade. I'm going up to prep for my morning colon cleanse. Sophie, when you're done, come to the kitchen. Today we're trying a new juice recipe. The laundry room door swung gently shut. Lucas stood alone in the faint yellow light, his face blank with disbelief at what was happening. 7:00 a.m. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, stretching across the glossy oak dining table. But it wasn't enough to dispel the coldness that permeated the space. Lucas sat at the head of the table, adjusting his shirt collar. Before him was a hearty plate of food, 3 slices of crispy, fragrant bacon, 2 sunny-side-up eggs with perfectly runny yolks, and several slices of crunchy garlic butter toast. The rich, savory aroma stimulated the appetite, but Lucas's throat was tight. He couldn't swallow. Opposite him, at the other end of the long, sprawling table, was Sophie. His daughter had changed out of her sweat-drenched pajamas into a crisp, plain gray home uniform, her hair neatly braided on both sides. Sophie sat up straight, her hands neatly placed on the table, staring intently at her breakfast. It wasn't a meal, it was a punishment. In a tiny, pristine white ceramic bowl lay 3 dry almonds and a small bunch of overcooked spinach, dark green and mushy. Next to it was a glass of frothy green celery juice, giving off its characteristic pungent odor. No milk, no cereal, nothing that held the slightest hint of childhood joy. Lucas watched his daughter. Sophie's small hand trembled as she held a silver spoon oversized for her grasp, trying to scoop a mushy spinach leaf into her mouth. But her hand shook too much and the leaf plopped back into the bowl. Sophie sighed subtly, placing her hand on her stomach. A loud, clear rumbling sound erupted from her stomach, shattering the morning's suffocating silence. That sound was a raw testament to the hunger gnawing at the gut of a 6-year-old child who had been awake and working since 3 a.m. Lucas glanced to his side. Isabella sat there leisurely sipping black coffee unsweetened. Her legs were crossed, one hand holding the ceramic cup the other, lightly scrolling through market news on her tablet. She completely ignored the child's hunger, acting as if the rumbling stomach were merely the sound of the wind rattling a window pane. "Are you hungry?" Sophie, Lucas asked, his voice steady, but underneath waves of anger were building. Sophie looked up, her eyes fearfully darting toward Isabella, then lowered her gaze back to the bowl of spinach. No. I'm fine, Daddy. I'm undergoing a cleanse. A cleanse? What kind of cleanse? You're a growing child. Lucas couldn't hold back anymore. He picked up his own fork and struck the side of his ceramic plate sharply. The jarring sound made Sophie jump, nearly dropping her spoon. Isabella merely frowned slightly, her finger pausing on the screen for a second before continuing to scroll without saying a word. Lucas stood up, picking up his plate of bacon and eggs, and gave it a firm push. The plate slid across the glossy wooden table, making a long, screeching sound of friction, and stopped right in front of Sophie. The rich aroma of crispy bacon wafted up, assaulting the heightened senses of the famished child. Eat this, Sophie. Daddy says you can. You need energy. Finish all of this for me. Sophie's eyes widened, fixed on the shimmering, oily slices of bacon under the sunlight. Her throat moved, gulping down saliva greedily. The strong instinct for survival surged, overcoming the vague fear. Sophie's small hand slowly reached out. Her thin, bony fingers trembled toward the silver fork stuck into a piece of bacon, only a few inches left. Isabella set her coffee cup down onto the saucer, very gently, very deliberately. But in this taut atmosphere, the sound was sharp as metal cutting glass. She didn't look up, her eyes still glued to the red and green stock charts, her voice sounding light as if chatting about the weather. It's up to you, Sophie. That bacon contains about 300 empty calories and saturated fat. Just one bite and all your hard work from 3 days of early morning detox will vanish into thin air. You know your visceral fat index is already at a warning level. Sophie's hand froze mid-air as if yanked back by an invisible string. Her fingers curled and stiffened. Isabella flipped to another news page, continuing, her voice devoid of emotion. Do you want to make Daddy happy for a temporary moment with that greasy piece of meat, or do you want to become a resilient person who knows how to control herself against trivial temptation? The choice is yours. I won't force you. Isabella's words were like a bucket of cold water splashed over Sophie's face. The child's eyes wavered fiercely. She looked at the fragrant plate of meat, then secretly glanced at her stepmother's cold, emotionless face. The fear of failure, of becoming a child without resilience, which Isabella so often instilled, suddenly became greater than the gnawing hunger. Sophie slowly retracted her hand. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Then, with a painful act of resolve, Sophie used both hands to forcefully push the plate of bacon away from the table edge. Isabella smiled, a thin, satisfied smile. She used a slender finger to tap the screen of her iPad, placing a green check mark in a box on the health tracking chart. Temptation control. Excellent. You make me so proud, Sophie. Lucas slumped back into his chair. He gripped the dinner knife in his hand, squeezing so hard that his knuckles turned white and blue veins popped out. He watched his daughter struggling to swallow the bitter spinach, watched Isabella's subtle, triumphant smile, and felt the powerlessness spreading through every vein. What do you think of Isabella's iron discipline? Is this education or subtle cruelty? If you were Lucas, what would you do when your child willingly refuses food out of fear? Leave a comment below, and don't forget to follow the next part to see how Lucas begins his counterattack. Lucas stormed out of the dining room, the heavy sound of his leather shoe soles hitting the wooden floor as if trying to crush the artificial silence covering the house. He said nothing more to Isabella, Nor did he look back at the daughter who was bent over eating bland boiled vegetables. He ran to his car, started the engine, and sped away, leaving a faint cloud of dust behind. His destination was the Central Chicago Financial Tower, home to the office of Marcus Hayes, his personal lawyer and confidant for 20 years. If anyone could help him end this legal insanity, it could only be Marcus. The high-speed elevator whisked Lucas up to the 45th floor in an instant. He pushed open the glass door and entered the familiar lawyer's office, ignoring the secretary who looked up ready to smile. Marcus was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, signing a thick stack of documents with a fountain pen. He wore a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit, his hair slicked back, exuding his usual elegance and composure. Without a word, Lucas pulled a bundle of photos from his jacket pocket pictures he had secretly taken of the meager breakfast and of Sophie standing on the stool at 3 a.m. He slammed them onto the polished desk. The photos slid, hitting the pen holder, scattering everywhere. "Look at this, Marcus. Take a good look. This is how she is raising my daughter." Marcus didn't flinch. He carefully set his fountain pen down on its stand, then looked up at Lucas through his thin, gold-rimmed glasses. His gaze was so calm, it bordered on emotionless, as if Lucas had just thrown down a boring report rather than evidence of child mistreatment. He picked up a photo. In it, the skinny Sophie was holding the scrubbing brush, her eyes dark-circled. Marcus adjusted his glasses, glanced at it for a fleeting second, then let it drop freely into the document shredder bin beneath his desk. "Lucas, you're too agitated. Sit down. You're wrinkling your suit. Agitated. You call me agitated when my daughter is being starved, being forced to work in the middle of the night. I want to strip Isabella of her custody rights immediately. Draw up the papers." Marcus sighed, shaking his head slightly as if looking at a child who didn't understand. Instead of taking out paper and pen to draft a lawsuit, he turned toward the wall and opened the built-in personal safe. He pulled out a thick, carefully spiral-bound folder with a deep blue cover the color of reliability. He slid the folder across the desk toward Lucas. "Before you start suing recklessly, you should look at this. This is the family's financial report for the last quarter compiled by Isabella." Lucas snatched the folder, flipping through the pages. Numbers danced before his eyes. His finger stopped at a chart with green columns. The column representing household expenses showed a sharp vertical drop beginning the moment Isabella moved in. "What do you see, Lucas?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. Lucas looked at the detailed expense line items. The line for maid salaries, $0. The line for nanny, $0. The line for personal driver, $0. All were perfect zeros. Isabella had fired the entire service staff, turning the Sterling mansion into a self-operating entity. But the truly alarming part was on the next page. Other expense categories had skyrocketed. The line for early childhood education investment, $15,000 per month. The line for high-end cognitive supplements, $8,000 per month. The line for elite online courses, $5,000 per month. This was accompanied by complete valid receipts signed off by reputable educational centers and pharmaceutical companies, some of which Lucas didn't realize Marcus had a stake in. Marcus pulled a laser pointer from his jacket pocket, aiming its red light at the final totals at the bottom of the page. Since Isabella took over, she's cut out all the wasteful spending on lazy service. Instead, she's channeled all financial resources into developing Sophie's intellect and health. Look, The total cost hasn't changed, but the quality of investment is entirely different. She isn't exploiting her Lucas. She is a financial genius. She is building your daughter's future. What future are you talking about? She's skin and bones. She's eating boiled vegetables instead of real food, Lucas roared, slamming his hand down on the desk. Marcus curled his lip into a thin, self-satisfied smile. He pulled another document from the drawer. How about this? It was a detailed comparison of work schedules over the past 6 months. One red column listed Lucas's schedule: London, Tokyo, Paris, Dubai. Thickly booked business trips, late-night social functions. The number of days he was actually home could be counted on one hand. The blue column listed Isabella's schedule: 6 o'clock a.m. Prepare nutritious breakfast 8 o'clock a.m. Drive Sophie to school 2 o'clock p.m. Supervise Sophie's life skills 7 o'clock p.m. Read bedtime stories to Sophie. It was dense with bullet points indicating dedication and 24/7 care. Lucas gripped the folder so tightly that the paper cover crumpled in his hands. He recognized the perfect legal trap that Isabella and Marcus had set. On paper, before any judge, he appeared to be an absent, extravagant father who only knew how to make money and neglect his child. Isabella, on the other hand, was the perfect stepmother, thrifty, scientific, sacrificing personal time to mold her stepdaughter. Do you see it, Lucas? Marcus stood up, walked around the desk, and placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. The pat was heavy, more of an imposition and a warning than an expression of camaraderie. If you sue her now with the flimsy evidence of child mistreatment, you're presenting like teaching a child chores or healthy eating, you will lose completely. The court will look at these numbers. They will see a modern mother trying to discipline an indulged child and an old-fashioned father obstructing that effort. Do you want to lose custody entirely? Marcus's gaze behind the lenses was cold and sharp, delivering an ultimatum to his friend: accept reality or lose everything. Lucas violently shook Marcus's hand off his shoulder. He backed away toward the door, breathing heavily. He looked at his closest friend, the man he had trusted with every legal and financial secret, now standing firmly as a bulwark defending Isabella's deceit. The initial shock gradually turned into profound suspicion. Why had Marcus prepared these documents so thoroughly? Why was he so blindly and systematically defending Isabella? You're not on my side, Lucas said, his voice hoarse. Marcus didn't answer, merely shrugging, turning toward the plate glass window overlooking the city below, leaving Lucas standing alone in the room. Lucas turned and bolted out of the lawyer's office. He slammed the door so hard that the brass plate reading Marcus Hayes, senior partner, rattled violently. He didn't take the elevator down to the garage to go home. He couldn't go home yet. He needed tangible proof, the kind that Marcus's paperwork couldn't cover up. Lucas rushed out onto the street and hailed a cab. The garage door closed behind the Bentley. Lucas checked his watch. 12:30 p.m. Sophie's life skills class lasted until 2 p.m., and Isabella usually spent this time at the spa. The house was completely deserted, engulfed in its usual silent stillness. Lucas quickly stepped inside, carrying a small cardboard box. He kept the lights off, heading straight for the large living room. In the corner of the room on the mantelpiece stood a white plaster bust of David, its sightless eyes staring into the vast space. Lucas grabbed the stool, climbed up, and carefully affixed a pea-sized device deep inside the bust's eye socket. A micro camera connected directly to his private server. Done with the task, he wiped his fingerprints, restored the bus to its original position, and left as swiftly as he had arrived. That evening, the atmosphere in the Sterling mansion was as cold as ever. After a meager dinner of boiled vegetables, Isabella and Sophie moved to the living room. Lucas excused himself, claiming he had an important video conference with partners in London. He went into the study, locked the door, and turned off the lights. Only the blue light from his computer screen illuminated his tense face. Lucas opened the surveillance software and entered the password. The screen displayed a live high-definition image of the living room. The high-angle shot encompassed the entire room. On the sapphire blue velvet sofa, Isabella was languidly reclined. She wore luxurious silk pajamas, a shimmering gold-flecked face mask resting on her face. She wore large noise-canceling headphones, and her right hand held a glass of red wine, gently swirling it to a rhythm only she could hear. In the lower corner of the frame, on the cold white marble floor, Sophie was kneeling. His 6-year-old daughter was not playing with toys nor watching TV. She was holding a tiny handkerchief, a small embroidered lace sachet used for wiping mouths, dipped in a small bowl of water placed nearby. Sophie wrung out the cloth, then bowed low, using her cloth-wrapped fingers to scrub along every grout line of the tiles. Meticulously, slowly, painfully. Sweat plastered the wisps of hair to her forehead. The back of her home uniform shirt was soaked in a large patch. Sophie moved on her knees, crawling from one tile to the next. After scrubbing a grout line, she would stop, lean her eyes close to the floor to check the cleanliness, and then scrub again if she wasn't satisfied. Occasionally, Sophie would lift her head, directing her tired eyes toward the sofa. Isabella still had her eyes closed, enjoying her music, but as if possessing a sixth sense, she slightly opened one eye, glancing down at the floor. Her slender diamond-ringed finger lightly pointed to a faint spot about half a meter from where Sophie was kneeling. Just a gentle point without need for words. Sophie immediately bowed low, her face filled with self-reproach and fear. She quickly crawled to the spot her stepmother indicated, scrubbing harder, faster, as if that invisible stain were a terrible transgression she had committed. Lucas watched the scene, his fists clenched so tightly they ached. This was not education. This was emotional torment veiled in a fake aristocratic shell. Isabella was turning his daughter into a willing slave, serving her laziness and vanity. "Enough," Lucas bellowed in the empty room. He grabbed the synchronized tablet, kicked open the study door, and rushed down the stairs. His footsteps pounded heavily on the wooden steps. He burst into the living room, slamming the tablet onto the glass coffee table right in front of Isabella. Clank. The sharp collision made the wine glass in Isabella's hand slosh, spilling a few drops of deep red onto the white sheepskin rug. Isabella slowly opened her eyes. She removed her headphones, placing them on her lap. Her hand went to her face, peeling off the gold-flecked mask, revealing smooth but icy skin. She looked at the tablet, which was replaying the footage of Sophie cleaning the floor, then looked up at Lucas, who was panting with rage. "Explain this. You're lying there listening to music, drinking wine, making that child clean the floor with a handkerchief. You call this education. This is exploitation." Lucas pointed at Sophie, who was huddled on the floor, her knees raw from kneeling so long. Isabella didn't stand up. She didn't argue either. Suddenly, her slender shoulders slumped. Her cold expression changed in an instant. Her eyes welled up and tears flowed down her cheeks perfectly like a professional actress. Her body began to tremble, and muffled sobs escaped her throat. You're spying on me again. You secretly placed a camera just to find fault with me." Isabella wailed, her voice breaking with hurt and offense. She pointed at Sophie, then covered her face and wept. "I tried my best. I have to play the villain, suppress my love for her just to teach her persistence and meticulousness. Do you know how much it hurts me to watch her work, but I have to be firm. I want her to grow up well, to have a beautiful soul. And yet you treat me like an exploiter." Lucas was stunned by Isabella's reaction. He was about to step forward, pull Sophie up, and remove her from this psychological battlefield. "Sophie, get up. You don't have to do this anymore. I forbid you." But before Lucas could touch her, Sophie unexpectedly darted out. The small, thin girl spread her skinny arms, shielding her stepmother from her father. She stood there protecting the woman who was weeping on the sofa, her eyes blazing with hostility and profound disappointment toward Lucas. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her face was distorted with emotion, her chest rising and falling violently. She used all her might to push forcefully against Lucas's thigh, forcing him to step back. "Go away, Daddy. You're mean. You made Mommy cry." Finally, the scream erupted, piercing and full of accusation. Sophie spun around and clung tightly to Isabella's legs. She used the hem of her own soiled uniform to clumsily wipe the tears from her stepmother's cheeks, stammering, "Don't cry, Mommy. I'm sorry. It's because I didn't clean enough. That's why Daddy scolded you. I'll do better." Then Sophie released Isabella and scrambled back to the floor. She pointed at the gleaming tiles, then placed her small hand over her left chest where her heart was pounding erratically. "Look, Daddy, the floor is clean. Mommy said if I clean the house well, my soul will be clean. I want to be refined. I don't want to be lazy like you." Lucas stood frozen in the middle of the luxurious living room. His arms dropped helplessly to his sides, the feeling of utter powerlessness draining all strength from his body. He looked at his daughter, the child he wanted to protect most, now kneeling on the floor once again. Sophie picked up the handkerchief and resumed scrubbing the wine stain that Isabella had spilled, constantly glancing at her stepmother to see if she had stopped crying. The action was an act of atonement, a blind devotion. Isabella remained seated, pretending to weep with her face covered, but through the gap between her slender fingers, Lucas caught her eye, a sharp, cold, and utterly triumphant look. She didn't say a word, but her eyes spoke volumes. "You lose, Lucas. She belongs to me." Lucas took one step back, then another. He turned his back and walked away in silence, leaving behind the rustling sound of the cloth on the marble and the fake choked sobs of the victorious woman. 6 months passed, and the Sterling house became a silent stage where everyone played their roles without shared dialogue. Lucas retreated behind the curtain, becoming an unwilling audience in his own family, only able to observe his daughter through silent meals and averted glances. Tonight, the drama moved to the opulent ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where the annual charity gala for Chicago's elite was being held. Crystal chandeliers shone down on hundreds of sparkling evening gowns, the clinking of glasses mingling with soft jazz music. Sophie entered the hall clutching Isabella's hand. Lucas's 6-year-old daughter looked like a little angel in a pristine white silk dress custom-fitted to her slender figure. Her fine hair was neatly tied up, adorned with an elegant black velvet bow. The child walked with a straight back, her chin slightly lifted, looking straight ahead, her steps light and noiseless. But her posture was rigid, unnatural, much like an expensive porcelain doll placed in a glass case, beautiful yet fragile. Isabella walked beside her, radiant in a sapphire blue gown, her meticulously applied makeup exuding an air of grandeur. She occasionally leaned down to whisper something into Sophie's ear, and the child would instantly nod, rapidly adjusting her stance or offering a social smile to strangers. Lucas lagged about 10 paces behind. He was surrounded by business associates offering greetings, but his eyes never left the two figures ahead. He saw Sophie shyly decline a plate of pastries from a server, her hand instinctively checking the fold of her dress for creases. The party was reaching its peak with everyone gathering around the champagne tower. A plump matron heavily adorned with diamond jewelry laughed loudly and swung her arm too wide. She accidentally bumped into a passing server's tray. Crash, the jarring sound of shattering glass silenced the entire hall. A glass of deep red wine spilled onto the white marble floor right next to Sophie's feet. The red liquid spread rapidly, splashing onto the pristine hem of her white dress. Other children nearby shrieked quickly, retreating behind their parents, afraid of the mess and sharp shards. But Sophie didn't back away. Almost instantly, a pre-programmed conditioned reflex took over. Sophie immediately dropped to her knees on the cold stone floor, right in the spreading pool of wine. Quick as a flash, she pulled a white silk handkerchief from a secret pocket sewn into the side of her dress. Her hands swiftly worked to soak up the wine puddle, the movements precise and strangely skillful. She showed no signs of disgust or embarrassment under the gaze of hundreds of people. Sophie vigorously scrubbed the wine, swirling in a clockwise motion, so the stain wouldn't spread, exactly the technique Isabella had taught her during the long nights in the living room. When the puddle was absorbed, the child even bent low, using her fingernail to lightly scrape the faint discoloration left on the stone surface, ensuring not a single trace remained. Finished, Sophie looked up. She didn't look at her father. She looked directly at the astonished, open-mouthed matron. Her eyes were wide, waiting. It was the same painful, familiar look Lucas saw every day at home, a look waiting for validation, waiting for a nod confirming, "I did well, I am clean." "Oh my," the matron exclaimed, clutching her chest. "What a well-behaved child. Aren't you afraid of the mess?" Sophie offered a perfect manufactured smile. "No, ma'am. Mommy taught me that a lady must know how to maintain cleanliness in every space she occupies. Messiness is the enemy of beauty." The surrounding crowd gasped in admiration. Scattered applause began and then swelled into a thunderous sound. Eyes full of admiration focused on Sophie. How talented, so well-behaved for a little one. She is certainly well-bred. Excellent upbringing. Isabella slowly stepped into the center of the crowd. She smiled modestly, placing her hand on Sophie's shoulder, gently, as if presenting a work of art she had personally sculpted. "Thank you for the kind words. Sophie has always been highly self-aware. I merely guide her in the right direction." She bent down and lightly kissed Sophie's hair. The child beamed, leaning close to her stepmother, savoring the moment of recognition that she had paid for with her childhood. Lucas stood on the edge of the crowd, pushed away by the congratulations. He watched the scene, a chill running down his spine. He saw in his daughter's eyes not genuine joy. It was fear. The constant fear that if she didn't immediately kneel and clean, If she left a spot, she would be branded a naughty child, a lazy child, a child undeserving of love. Lucas's right hand gripped the stem of the champagne glass he was holding. Crack. The sound of glass fracturing was tiny, drowned out by the applause. The stem snapped in two, the sharp edge cutting into his palm. A streak of fresh blood mingled with the wine dripping onto the red carpet. But Lucas didn't feel the pain. This physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish of watching his child turn into a perfect puppet in someone else's hands. He let go. The broken glass fell into a nearby waste bin. Lucas turned his back, not saying goodbye to anyone. He pushed through the crowd, quickly walking out of the opulent hall, leaving behind the laughter and the artificial glow. He rushed into the darkness of the deserted underground parking garage. The damp air and the smell of gasoline stung his nose, but made him feel more alert than ever. Lucas pulled out his phone. The screen lit up clearly, showing his face set in fierce determination. He dialed a number he had hesitated to call for the past 6 months. Hello, Private Investigator Service. I need to hire someone for 24/7 surveillance, starting tonight. He hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. It was time he stopped playing the role of the audience. If Isabella wanted to play the game of manipulation through perfection, he would tear that facade down, even if he had to resort to the most reckless measures. The battle to reclaim his daughter had truly begun. A well-behaved child or a victim of psychological manipulation. Have you ever encountered children who were too understanding to the point of heartbreak, like Sophie? Continue to follow Lucas in his lonely fight to reclaim his daughter's childhood in the final chapters. The Bentley tore down the deserted avenue, leaving behind the brightly lit hotel from the charity gala. Lucas gripped the steering wheel, the stinging pain from the cut on his palm, reminding him that his patience had reached its limit. He had been an audience member for too long. Tonight, this perfect play had to end. As soon as he arrived home, Lucas didn't enter through the main door. He stormed straight into the living room, which was filled with iron discipline charts and Sophie's dense schedule. He tore them all down. The dry sound of ripping paper echoed sharply. He gathered up all the cognitive monitoring tablets and the green bottles of detox juice from the refrigerator, dumping everything into the large trash can outside. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the dining room, but the space was no longer marked by the usual deadly silence. There was the clinking of dishes, the smell of butter and milk, and the bustling sound of footsteps. Mrs. Gable, the former housekeeper with the high bun of gray hair, was busy in the kitchen. Lucas had called her early that morning, inviting her to return to work. She looked around the cold, modern kitchen with confusion, her hands nervously placing a plate of hot pancakes and a glass of fresh milk on the dining table. She wasn't used to this silence. She remembered Sophie's laughter from the old days. Lucas stood in the dining room pointing at the table. "Just follow my instructions, Mrs. Gable. From today, Sophie will eat like a normal child. No boiled vegetables, no celery juice." Leaning against the kitchen door frame, Isabella stood there. She had woken up early, meticulously applied makeup, and was dressed in a neat business dress. Her arms were crossed, and she watched Lucas and Mrs. Gable busy preparing breakfast with a contemptuous smirk. She said nothing, offered no resistance, only observed as if watching a clumsy comedy. Sophie walked down the stairs. She wore her usual home uniform, but her dark-circled eyes clearly showed exhaustion after the performance the night before. When she saw the table full of high-calorie items and the sight of Mrs. Gable cleaning, Sophie froze. She huddled back toward the foot of the stairs. "Daddy, what is all that? What is Mrs. Gable doing here, Mommy?" Bella said she wasn't clean. "Come eat breakfast, Sophie." "Mrs. Gable made you pancakes." Lucas pulled out a chair trying to smile. Sophie looked at the golden pancakes drizzled with sweet syrup. She swallowed hard, but fear immediately overcame her hunger. In her mind, that wasn't food. It was a poison that would dull her mind, something that would turn her into a lazy failure. "I won't eat it, Mommy Bella. Daddy is making me eat dirty food." Lucas lost his patience. He stepped over, lifted her up, and placed her in the chair, pushing the plate of pancakes close to her face. "Eat it. I don't want to hear any more of those crazy theories." Sophie panicked. She swung her arm and knocked the plate away. Crash. The ceramic plate shattered on the tile floor. Syrup and pancakes scattered everywhere. Sophie jumped down from the chair, retreating into the corner of the room, clutching her flat stomach with both hands. She looked at Lucas with horror, as if he had just offered her a bowl of poison. "You're mean, Daddy. You want me to become stupid so I can't be an elite person anymore, don't you?" Isabella finally strolled forward. She walked past Sophie, pretending to accidentally bend down to pick up a shard near the child's feet. She leaned close to Sophie's ear, whispering softly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "See, Sophie, Daddy is destroying your future. He hates our perfection." Having said that, Isabella straightened up. She didn't argue with Lucas. She calmly turned, picked up a pre-packed suitcase near the front door. "Fine, Lucas. You want to parent her your way, go ahead. I'm leaving. I can't watch you ruin my efforts of all these years." The sound of the suitcase wheels rolling across the floor was like a thunderclap to Sophie. The child's eyes widened as she watched Isabella pull the suitcase toward the door. "Mommy Bella, where are you going? Don't leave me." The fear of abandonment, the terror of poverty and chaos that Isabella had instilled erupted. Sophie lunged out, clinging tightly to Isabella's legs, sobbing uncontrollably. "Don't go, Mommy. If Daddy drives you away, we'll be ruined. I'll be good. I won't eat the pancakes. I'll work harder on the chores." Lucas rushed over, prying his daughter's hands off Isabella's legs. He pushed Isabella out the door and slammed it shut. The decisive click of the lock echoed. "Go, don't you ever come back inside the house," Sophie screamed, pounding her fists on the closed wooden door. "Open the door. Daddy is a terrible person. He made us poor." Lucas lifted the struggling child and carried her upstairs, ignoring her piercing screams. He locked himself and his daughter in the house, determined to restore order, even if he had to start from this wreckage. That night, the house was submerged in tense silence. Lucas sat in the living room, wearily rubbing his temples. Sophie had locked herself in her room all day, refusing to eat or drink. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound coming from the upstairs bathroom, the familiar haunting sound of scrubbing. Lucas ran upstairs. The bathroom door was locked from the inside. "Sophie, what are you doing in there? Open the door." There was no answer, only the sound of a scrubbing brush hitting ceramic, getting faster and more desperate. Mrs. Gable was sloppy. There are still stains on the toilet. Mommy Bella will be angry if she sees it. She won't give us money for groceries. Sophie's muttering drifted out, sounding delirious. Lucas didn't hesitate. He stepped back for leverage and rammed his shoulder hard into the door. Boom! The door burst open. Sophie was kneeling by the toilet. She was using her own toothbrush, furiously scrubbing the rim of the bowl. Dirty water splattered onto her face and her clean pajamas. She was scrubbing and crying, at the same time her tears mixing with the grime. "Stop it right now!" Lucas rushed in, wresting the toothbrush from her hand. He kicked over the bucket of cleaning solution she had placed nearby. Water sprayed everywhere, soaking both of them. "Let go of me! I have to finish. Mommy Bella is coming back!" Sophie thrashed violently. In her extreme panic from being prevented from completing the mission, to save the family, she lost control. She opened her mouth and bit down hard on Lucas's forearm. Lucas cried out in pain, instinctively letting go. Sophie retreated to the corner, curled up, shivering violently. Her mouth was bloody from the bite. She looked at Lucas with intense hatred and fear, as if he were a monster who had just destroyed her only world of security. "Get out, Daddy. You ruined everything. I hate you." Lucas clutched his bleeding forearm, standing stunned in the soaking wet bathroom. He looked at his little daughter, now strangely wild and heartbreakingly distant. He wanted to go and hug her, but Sophie's eyes stopped him. Suddenly, a flash of light burst from the doorway of the now broken bathroom. Lucas spun around. Isabella was standing there. She had returned at some point, no longer in her neat business clothes, but wearing a dark hooded coat. In her hand, she held her phone, the lens pointed directly at the chaotic scene in the bathroom. The furious father, with a fresh bleeding wound, the soaking wet child huddled in fear, and the shattered mess surrounding them. Isabella's thumb pressed the red button on the screen. "Stop recording." She lowered the phone. A thin, triumphant smile appeared on her lips. She didn't say a word, only looked deeply at Lucas, the look of a hunter who had just seen her prey walk straight into the trap. "Thank you, Lucas. You just gave me the best evidence for the upcoming trial." She turned and walked away, leaving Lucas standing there, blood from his forearm dripping onto the floor, mixing with the dirty water, while Sophie's uncontrollable sobbing echoed in the confined space. The next morning, Lucas drove Sophie to Dr. Thorne's clinic. He had to use force lifting the screaming child who refused to leave the house because she hadn't finished cleaning the stairs. His forearm was still bandaged, throbbing with pain every time he moved, but that was nothing compared to the worry consuming his heart. He needed independent medical proof. Dr. Thorne's clinic was located in the high-end medical district, clean and quiet. Thorne was a renowned specialist whom Lucas had chosen based on his impeccable background. In the waiting room, a young nurse smiled kindly, offering Sophie an orange gummy bear vitamin. "Here you go, honey. It's a vitamin C chew." Sophie looked at the candy as if it were a deadly insect. She pulled her hand back, shrinking against the sofa, her eyes wide with caution. "How many calories is that? Does it have artificial sugar?" "Please don't poison me." The nurse froze her hand, still suspended with the candy. Dr. Thorne stood at the door of his examination room, holding a clipboard. He adjusted his glasses, observed Sophie's reaction, and quickly scribbled notes. "Obsessive-compulsive cleanliness, avoidant psychological eating disorder," Thorne muttered, not looking at Lucas. "No, it's not." Lucas jumped up. "She's been brainwashed. Isabella forbade her from eating sweets, threatening her with empty calories for 6 months. Look at her. She's skin and bones. He pulled a stack of photos from his briefcase, pictures of meals consisting only of boiled vegetables and celery juice. He spread them out on Thorne's desk. This is the proof. My daughter is being subtly starved. The examination room door opened. Marcus and Isabella walked in. Isabella wore a stylish dress carrying a large insulated bag. Marcus walked beside her, his expression as composed as if he had just dropped by casually. "Lucas, you're bothering the doctor again," Isabella said, her voice gentle but full of reproach. She placed the insulated bag on the desk and opened it. Inside were high-end food containers, seared salmon pumpkin chia seed soup, organic chicken breast salad. Marcus placed a thick stack of invoices next to it. "Doctor, look at this. These are the grocery receipts from the past month. Norwegian salmon, Wagyu beef, organic vegetables delivered fresh from the farm every day. Isabella has never spared expense on the child's nutrition." Isabella took out a salmon container and opened the lid. The fragrant smell wafted through the room. She held it out toward Sophie, her eyes tender in a terrifying way. "Sophie, have a little bite. Mommy prepared this early this morning." Sophie looked at the salmon fillet. Her stomach rumbled. But immediately, an invisible fear took hold. She shook her head wildly, pushing the container away. "I won't eat it. I haven't finished cleaning the stairs. I don't deserve good food. Mommy Bella said lazy people only get to eat vegetables." Dr. Thorne sighed, shaking his head at Lucas. He avoided looking Lucas directly in the eye, gazing elsewhere. "Mr. Sterling, the issue isn't the food. The issue is the child's psyche is self-punishing. The child feels guilty for not meeting the family's expectations. And in my observation, the root cause is the imposition and lack of emotional support from the father." "You're lying." Lucas slammed his hand on the table. "I demand a blood test immediately. The results will prove she is malnourished." Thorne reluctantly agreed. 2 hours later, the test results came back. Sophie had severe iron and calcium deficiency, and her BMI was alarmingly low. Lucas held the result sheet, letting out a bitter, sarcastic laugh. "Now what do you say? Do your receipts for Wagyu beef save her blood count?" Dr. Thorne took the result sheet, returned to his desk, and typed on his computer. The clatter of the keyboard echoed in the tense space. He printed out an official medical report stamped with a red seal and handed it to Lucas. Lucas skimmed it. The final conclusion made his vision blur. Cause: prolonged exposure to stressful environment leading to inhibited nutrient absorption. Recommendation: patient must be separated from the main source of stress, the father, to stabilize her psychological state. Lucas choked his hand, trembling with rage. He looked down at Thorne's signature next to the note: "Trusted guardian during therapy, Isabella Sterling." Marcus stood leaning against the glass cabinet of medical supplies, his arms crossed. He smirked, pulling a yellow envelope sealed with the red stamp of the Cook County Family Court from his jacket pocket. "The medical evidence is clear, Lucas, doctor. Thorne is a leading specialist. His word carries more weight in court than any of your shouting." He handed the envelope to Lucas. "Emergency summons and a temporary restraining order based on the video of you assaulting the child last night. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Lucas held the envelope, feeling as though he was holding a death sentence. He looked over at Sophie. She was curled up on the examination chair, nervously fiddling with the hem of her shirt. Marcus signaled to 2 large security guards standing outside the door. They approached Lucas, their demeanor firm. "Mr. Sterling, please vacate the premises immediately. You are in violation of the restraining order." Lucas looked at his daughter one last time. "Sophie." Hearing his call, Sophie flinched. She didn't run toward her father. She quickly jumped off the chair, running to hide behind Isabella, clinging tightly to her stepmother's dress. She didn't dare look at her father, only peeking over Isabella's shoulder with eyes full of fear, as if he were the cause of all the trouble, all the hunger, and all the pain she was enduring. Lucas was escorted out the door by the two guards. The examination room door closed in front of him, separating him completely from the daughter who was trembling in the arms of the woman who had ruined her childhood. 1 week after the incident at the clinic, the emergency custody hearing took place at the Cook County Family Court. The air in the courtroom was thick and heavy, as if a storm was about to break. Lucas sat at the defense table next to a brand new public attorney he had been forced to hire quickly after part of his accounts were frozen. Opposite him, Marcus sat calmly, his expensive navy suit gleaming under the overhead lights, occasionally leaning in to whisper to Isabella. Sophie sat between them. The child wore a formal black velvet dress, her hair neatly braided, clutching a worn cloth doll. She kept her head bowed, her feet dangling without touching the ground, completely lost in the cruel legal battle of the adults. Judge Miller, a stern-looking middle-aged woman with her salt and pepper hair in a high bun and thick horn-rimmed glasses, rapped her gavel to open the session. She flipped through the files, her sharp eyes scanning both sides, settling on Lucas with undisguised scrutiny. "Counsel for the petitioner, please present your evidence." Marcus stood up, adjusting his tie. He didn't use many flowery words. He simply pointed toward the large screen hanging in the middle of the courtroom. "Your Honor, this video was recorded on the night of May 12th at the Sterling residence. It speaks for itself." The screen lit up. The shaky but clear image appeared. In the video, Lucas, disheveled and wild-eyed, rushed into the bathroom. His shouts echoed through the quiet courtroom. "Stop it right now, let go of her." This was followed by scenes of a chaotic struggle, the bucket of dirty water being thrown, and the climax was the close-up shot of Lucas's bleeding forearm, and Sophie huddled in the key corner, shaking uncontrollably, her mouth smeared with blood, her eyes wide with terror, looking at her father. The entire courtroom murmured. Judge Miller frowned, constantly writing in her notepad. The video ended. Isabella slowly stood up. She wasn't weeping hysterically as she did at home. Today she played the role of a distressed but resilient stepmother. She stepped onto the witness stand, gently lifting Sophie's sleeve. "Your Honor, please look at these hands." Sophie's small hands were revealed under the lights. The skin was rough, cracked, and her fingertips were peeling off in large red patches, the marks of hundreds of hours soaking in cleaning chemicals. This is the result of the child having to clean up the battlefields her father created. Every time he was drunk or angry, Isabella said, her voice choked, but clear. "I tried to stop her, but the child was too terrified. She believed that if she didn't clean, her father would do something worse." Lucas leaped up, hitting the table. "She's lying. She forced her to do it. She brainwashed her order." The judge slammed the gavel sharply. "Defense, sit down. You will have your turn." Lucas's lawyer awkwardly stood up, trying to salvage the situation. "Your Honor, my client asserts this is subtle child labor exploitation disguised as education. The child was coerced." But Marcus immediately cut him off. He turned to Sophie, his voice soft like a kindly uncle. Sophie tell the court, "Did anyone force you to do chores, or did you volunteer to help Mommy Bella?" All eyes focused on Sophie. The child huddled closer, her hands twisting together. She glanced at Isabella. Isabella said nothing, only lightly placed her hand over her left chest where her heart was beating. That was the secret signal between them. "Clean soul," Sophie swallowed hard, shaking her head vigorously. "No one forced me. I wanted to do it myself. I want my soul to be clean." Lucas's lawyer was silenced. Judge Miller sighed, taking off her glasses to wipe them. She looked at the thin child, then at the desperate Lucas. She decided to use the last measure to determine the truth. "Sophie, please come up here. I just want to ask you one question." Sophie tentatively stepped up to the witness stand. The stand was too high for her. The judge leaned down, her voice becoming gentler. "Sophie, no one here will hurt you. Look at your father and look at Mommy Bella. Tell me, who do you feel safest with?" The entire room held its breath. Sophie lifted her large round eyes to look at Lucas. In that moment, Lucas tried to smile at his daughter. He wanted to convey warmth, protection, but his smile was twisted and pathetic from grief and anxiety. In Sophie's eyes now, that smile brought back the image of the father who shouted at her to eat greasy meat, the father who broke down the door to stop her from saving the family from ruin. The fear of chaos, the fear of poverty that Isabella had implanted, surged powerfully. Sophie turned to look at Isabella. The stepmother sat there, secretly dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. She looked at Sophie with an encouraging gaze full of sacrifice. Sophie pointed toward Isabella. The child's voice was small, but echoed like a death knell for Lucas's hope. "I want to stay with Mommy Bella. She needs my help. And Daddy just makes me scared. He breaks plates. He shouts at me." Judge Miller nodded. She put her glasses back on and picked up the wooden gavel. "Based on the video evidence, the medical report, and the child's direct wish, the court declares the temporary custody rights of Mr. Lucas Sterling over the child, Sophie Sterling, are hereby revoked. Custody and asset management are transferred to Mrs. Isabella." Crack. The sound of the gavel striking the wood table rang out decisively. "Mr. Sterling must vacate the mansion within 24 hours. The restraining order is effective immediately. No Sophie." "You don't understand," Lucas cried out, lunging past the barrier toward his daughter. But two court officers quickly rushed in and restrained him. "Let me go. That's my daughter. She's a fraud." He was forcibly dragged out of the courtroom. He twisted his head to look back. Sophie was still sitting on the witness stand, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. She didn't dare follow her father's receding figure. She had chosen the artificial security of the gilded cage over the freedom filled with vague fears outside. The heavy wooden door of the courtroom slammed shut in front of Lucas. The dry crash completely separated him from the world inside. Lucas stood alone in the deserted hallway, the stark white neon light illuminating the devastating failure on the face of the man who once had everything. He clutched the bundle of house keys, the things he was about to surrender, so tightly that the sharp edges cut into his skin and drew blood. 2 weeks after the court ruling. Lucas parked the old rented pickup truck across the street opposite the gates of the Sterling mansion. He wore a faded t-shirt and a baseball cap pulled low, hiding his eyes dark-circled from lack of sleep. He was no longer the dapper businessman in designer suits. He was now a deprived father, a stalker outside his own home. The Chicago midday sun was blazing, pouring down like fire. The heat rising from the asphalt blurred the view behind the ornate iron gates. In the courtyard of the mansion, under the cool shade of the old oak tree, Isabella was stretched out on a wicker swing chair. She wore large sunglasses, held a glass of iced orange juice, and her feet swayed to the rhythm of music coming from a nearby Bluetooth speaker. Next to her were piles of shopping bags from luxury brands recently delivered by a shipper scattered on the green lawn. In another corner of the yard, where there was no cover, the sun beat down fiercely. Sophie, the small 6-year-old girl, was struggling to pull a heavy rubber hose. She wore old, oversized, ill-fitting clothes and yellow rubber boots too large for her tiny feet. Before her was Isabella's fiery red Porsche sports car, still covered in mud from a weekend trip to the countryside. Sophie stood on her toes, trying to spray water onto the car's hood. The strong water pressure made her arms tremble violently, the hose nearly slipping from her grip. Water splashed onto her face and body, soaking her from head to toe, but Sophie didn't dare stop to wipe her face. She scrubbed the muddy wheels, muttering calculations to herself, her small voice lost in the rushing water. Washing the car at the shop costs $50. If I wash it, Mommy Bella won't have to spend money. Daddy won't be poor. I'm a helpful child. Lucas sat in his truck observing everything through binoculars. Every drop of sweat on his daughter's cheek felt like a drop on his own heart. The exhaustion, yet grim determination in Sophie's eyes suffocated him. He placed his hand on the car door handle. His knuckles were white. He wanted to rush out, tear down that gate, pull Isabella off the swing chair, and carry his daughter far away. But he stopped. The image of a patrol car driving by and the temporary restraining order lying on the passenger seat reminded him of the brutal reality. One rash action now would send him to jail, and Sophie would be permanently trapped by Marcus and Isabella. Sophie finished washing the car. She tiredly dropped the hose. She stood panting for a moment, then by unconscious habit looked toward the iron gate. Her eyes met the unfamiliar pickup truck parked across the street. She squinted against the glaring sun, trying to see through the tinted glass. Lucas slowly lowered his window. Just a crack. Enough for the hot, stuffy air to rush into the cool cab. He took off his baseball cap, revealing a haggard face, but eyes blazing with resolve. Sophie froze. She recognized her father. In that moment, time seemed to stop. Sophie looked at her father, then back at Isabella, who was lounging comfortably and drinking juice, then at her own hands wrinkled from the water. A vague realization began to dawn in the 6-year-old's mind. Lucas didn't wave. He simply looked straight into his daughter's eyes, nodding slowly, firmly. A silent promise. I'm here. I'm not giving up. Beside Lucas, the elderly private investigator subtly cleared his throat. Mr. Sterling, I've recorded enough. She is violating child labor regulations and neglecting supervision. Plus the financial fraud records from those shell corporations we found this morning. It's enough to turn the tables. Lucas turned, looking at the camera screen clearly displaying Isabella lounging while his daughter performed strenuous labor. Call the police and call Child Protective Services. Right now. 15 minutes later. The wail of sirens shattered the quiet of the affluent neighborhood. 2 police cars and a Child Protective Services van screeched to a halt outside the Sterling mansion gates. Isabella flinched, dropping her glass of orange juice onto the lawn. She quickly stood up, not yet understanding what was happening when the gate was pushed open. The police swarmed in, showing an emergency search warrant and a temporary arrest warrant for suspicion of large-scale financial fraud. The social worker, a large, warm African-American woman, walked straight toward Sophie. She knelt down, disregarding the muddy puddle, gently taking the child's soaked hands. "Hello, sweetie. I'm here to take you for a break. You've been working too hard." Sophie stared at the woman blankly, then looked at Isabella, who was screaming objections at the police. The child panicked, about to run back to protect her mother, but then her eyes caught Lucas stepping out of the pickup truck, accompanied by the police chief. No more elegant suit, no more agitated look. Lucas walked calmly, steadily. He went straight to Sophie, kneeling on one knee on the hot paving stones. "Sophie." He called her name, his voice deep and warm, without shouting or coercion. He opened his arms wide, waiting. Isabella, handcuffed, screamed, "Sophie, tell them to go away. Mommy is teaching you. Tell them you volunteered." Sophie looked at the angry, distorted face of Isabella, then at her father, patiently waiting with open arms. The brainwashing about poverty and perfection suddenly shattered before the harsh reality. She let the car wash rag fall to the ground. She took one tentative step toward Lucas, then 2 steps, and then she burst into tears, running into her father's embrace. "Daddy, I'm tired. I don't want to wash the car anymore." Lucas held her tight, feeling her small, sweat-drenched body shaking in his arms. He lifted her up, burying his face in her son's scorched hair. "Let's go home, sweetheart. No more washing cars, no more cleaning floors. Just be a child." The police car carrying Isabella and Marcus drove away. Lucas carried Sophie out of the iron gates, the place he had been banished from. He carefully buckled her into the back seat of the old pickup truck. They didn't return to the cold mansion immediately. Lucas drove her to a small park by the lake. He bought her a huge ice cream cone, the chocolate kind she used to love before the prohibitions. Sophie held the cone hesitatingly, looking at her father. This is a lot of calories, Daddy." Lucas smiled, a genuine smile, though his eyes were stinging with tears. He bought one for himself, taking a large bite. "Yeah, it is, but today you and I need a little sweetness. Eat it, sweetheart. Get a little plump so I have the strength to carry you." Sophie watched her father eat happily. She tentatively put her tongue out to lick the cold ice cream. The sweet taste of chocolate melted on her tongue, spreading through her mouth, awakening buried memories of happy childhood. A shy, wobbly but genuine smile appeared on Sophie's smudged face. She took another bite, bigger and bolder. Lucas watched her eat, knowing the road ahead was long. The psychological wounds, the obsession with perfection, would not vanish after one ice cream cone. It would take much time, much patience and therapy to heal her. But looking at the afternoon sun glittering on the lake and the streak of ice cream on his daughter's lip, he knew the nightmare had truly ended. Normal life, imperfect but filled with love, had just begun. The story serves as a sharp warning against subtle emotional abuse disguised as elite education. Sometimes the deepest wounds are not on the skin, but in a child's distorted belief that I am only worthy of love when I am useful. Perfection is the most dangerous gilded cage. Let us not allow beautiful titles or glamorous facades to blind us to the silent cries for help. True love must be a place where children are allowed to make mistakes, be lazy sometimes, and be themselves, not a transactional contract based on obedience. Note: the above story is entirely fictional. All character names, locations, and events have been created solely for the purpose of conveying an educational and artistic message. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental.